Welcome. The information I have for you in the presentation are simply my opinions. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've seen and heard a lot of things over the years, and then hopefully my opinions are informed opinions. But if you, for whatever reason, don't agree with what I say, there's no problem with that. In fact, differences of opinions can be healthy. Bell Bank has become one of the largest independently owned banks in the country, and it really is a remarkable North Dakota success story, with the two major ownership families having strong ties to rural North Dakota and to its agriculture. At the start of the COVID outbreak, I tried working from home for a few days, and as you can see by the picture, it didn't work, and it didn't work for me or for my wife. So I went back to the office, and I've been back to the office every day since. I'm not particularly proud of the picture, but I also believe, as this slide says, you can't hurt my feelings, because I used to hold a flashlight for my dad, and that never went very well. So let's talk a little bit about the China trade agreement. And just as a disclaimer, I'm certainly not an expert in trade matters or government policy, but again, these are simply my opinions from what I see and what I read and what I'm hearing. Obviously, the recent spike in commodity prices have been helped and fueled by China buying a lot of our commodities. But it is interesting to note that a lot of times there are sales announced, but until those sales actually become loaded on ships and go across the ocean, whatever, they sometimes can be canceled. This is an interesting chart about our exports to China of farm products. And it's interesting to note that, we've been up and down over the years. Especially in 18 and 19 when we were having the trade disputes. When you look at 2020, it looks like a really big spike, and it is if we get there. As I'll talk about a little bit later, actually our current export level to China is probably about where it was in 2016 and 2017. It's worth noting that we are not obviously the only source of ag products being shipped to China. In fact, we represent a relatively small slice of the overall ag product pie in terms of what they're importing. Clearly there's times they need us, and there are times that they don't. This is another interesting chart with regard to the soybeans that are being exported to China from mainly Brazil and the United States. This chart is a little bit misleading, as they probably are at the high point of the exports from Brazil during the front 6 months, with the U.S. exports probably ramping up in the back 6 months. But it does point out that the U.S. Market share percent continues to decline. We often hear a lot about phase one of the China trade agreement, and what does that really mean? My understanding is, as part of the trade agreement, China agreed to buy about $36.5 billion of ag products by the end of the year, and through the end of October now, they were at about $23.6 billion, about 71%. But ag exports was just one piece of the overall trade agreement, which had China buying about $140 billion worth of goods from the U.S. My understanding is at the end of the third quarter, they were about $60 billion in purchased, where they should be at about $108 billion. So they've got a ways to go. No doubt that agriculture is always at the tip of the spear in trade disputes. So we really become a pawn for a lot of the political issues and so forth that happen between countries. But this trade agreement with regard to agriculture is really about pork and beans. It's about protein. Although corn has really been a pretty large part of their purchases in the last couple of months. It's interesting to note that China has somewhere between 350 and 400 million hogs, and to put that in perspective, the U.S. has typically around 75 million hogs at any one time. So China has 5 to 6 times more hogs than the U.S., and hogs eat a lot of corn, they eat a lot of protein or a lot of soybeans. Are trade agreements made to be broken? It seems more and more as they are. Long-term trade agreements are much tougher to be adhered to than they used to be. And also, I believe that the enforcement of these trade agreements is set to start in February of 2021. So if there's a shortfall in the purchase of whatever, that is to be addressed in early 21. Why is China buying now? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Number one, Brazil is basically out of beans until harvest, and they're actually just planting right now. And Interesting to note that Brazil is even looking at importing beans from the U.S. right now. So we are probably one of the few places that they can get their soybeans. Food security, I think if China leaders have found out anything over the centuries, is what their population needs to be fed if they want to limit social unrest. So feeding the population is number one. Price, positive growth. China reportedly has about a 5% positive GDP. One of the few countries that has a positive GDP right now. They clearly have limits on their own production. Weather has been tough. They have a lot of toxicity in their soil and just not a lot of places to grow the production that they need for their population. So they have made a decision to largely outsource a lot of their needs. And this is the one that just kind of can come into play, and that's just-in-time supply chain issues. Just like anything else, I mean, we've become accustomed to not having to order a long ways in advance. But quite frankly, right now, China is building up reserves in all likelihood, so that if there is another supply chain disruptions, they have the adequate reserves on hand to weather that. A number of years ago, China instituted a Belt and Road Initiative, and this really kind of emulates what they did centuries ago with the Silk Roads and so forth. And China was the world's power for about 600 years, and quite frankly, they'd like that back. So this multi-trillion-dollar project is designed to connect infrastructure to China. As of the beginning of the year, they had about 138 countries signed on, spending about $50 to $100 billion a year, building mainly power, transportation, roads, and so forth, that ultimately not only benefit the country that they're in, but has benefits back to China. Obviously, with a slowdown in the economy and the COVID, that Belt and Road Initiative has slowed recently. You know, obviously, there's a lot of skeptics that think this is kind of a Trojan horse as a way for them to get into these countries and have more control. The Chinese are very shrewd. I mean, they're very good negotiators. They know how to extrapolate information and technology and things to their gain. But what is the end game to all of this? I think they want to become self-sufficient through these programs as much as possible. While we focus an awful lot on China with regard to agricultural trade, we really can't forget about Mexico, Canada, Japan, as being reliable trading partners, especially Mexico and Canada. Combined, they are a larger trading partner than China. They're right next door. They're probably a little bit more stable as trading partners than China. Interestingly enough, I believe Mexico just made a huge corn buy from the U.S. that is certainly going to benefit our producers. We're also working on longer and better trade agreements with the European Union and the UK. In planning beyond 2020, we really need to be a little bit cautious about relying on the same level of government aid as we saw in 2020. This is a great chart that, quite frankly, shows you a historical example of the government aid that's happened over the last decade, but especially focusing in on 2020 and the $25 billion of payments that are really ad hoc or supplementary that likely aren't going to be there year after year. And these come from a whole slew of, you know, I call it an alphabet soup of acronyms with CARES and CFAP 1.0, 2.0, WIP Plus, PPP. It's really been hard to keep track of all those programs, but again, the reality is relying on that level of government payments going forward is probably a little bit in error. This is another interesting chart, and I apologize that it's a little hard to read, but this is all the government aid in the last decade for all the different farm programs. And if you take a look again at 2020, or even in 2019 with the big MFP payments largely being replaced by the supplemental or ad hoc payments that we just talked about earlier, these level of payments at $37 billion, we haven't been close to those in previous years, and likely it would be difficult to replicate this in future years. This slide represents just North Dakota, and it's got data through 2019. It doesn't have 2020 data in there, but it shows you what the level of government payments have been in North Dakota over the years. It is interesting of note in 2018 and 2019 combined about $1 billion in MFP payments. I think as producers we need to be cautious on recent government aid masking underlying issues on operation. that if you didn't have government aid, they would certainly come to the forefront. This is a chart on U.S. net farm income over the last 50 years, and it does show, for example, in 2020 that government payments represent about a third of the U.S. net farm income. It's also good to realize that the government can giveth, but the government can taketh away. This is a chart that shows over the last 20 years the net cash farm income and the net farm income for U.S. farm producers. The major difference is the cash income is strictly cash revenue over cash expenses, where net farm income has some accrual adjustments and also takes in some depreciation. But what it doesn't include in both of these is family living, debt payments. So when you see these numbers at $100 billion in net farm income or $115 billion in net farm cash income, it looks pretty impressive, but there's a lot of uses for that cash that need to be made, and it's not necessarily a great reflection on the financial health of U.S. agriculture. This is just another way to take a look at the U.S. farm program payments, and again, historically, both in 2019 and 2020, how much of those payments, both in terms of MFP and ad hoc and disaster payments, made up the totality of the government payments. This slide puts it even in a more eye-opening perspective on reliance on government payments than the other slides. This is FinBin data from 2019, and FinBin is just a compilation of a farm management database. And in 2019, for crop and grain producers, government payments were about 95% of their net income. We all know 2020 is considerably higher, so this will be a real interesting number to see what 2020 turns out to be. Just a few additional thoughts on the government aid issue. You know, obviously with 2020 being an election year, the government aid faucet has been wide open, and by now we'll know the results of the election and you know, whether or not we have a blue wave or not. You know, there could be some changes in public policy, and in that light, the support for agriculture from a public policy standpoint, you know, what is that going to be? You know, given that more and more people are 1, 2, 3 generations removed from the farm, they simply don't have a good perspective of what goes into that and the risks that are in agriculture. Crop insurance, I just simply don't think we can put that at risk. That is the ultimate risk management tool, and sometimes that kind of gets lost in the dust in a year like this when there's so much other government money floating around. You know, it's a little bit ironic that, you know, most producers want to keep the government out of their business until they need help. And I know the urban legislators sometimes jump on that, so we probably need to work on a consistent message. The support for ethanol, huge. You know, whether it be the renewable fuel standards issue or the small refinery exemption, you know, given that ethanol takes in about 5 billion of the 14 billion bushels of corn we produce, it is hugely important. And what's the risks of lack of support for ethanol? It's significant. One of the big risks is right here. It's electric cars. And electric cars are real. People are really sold on those. You know, we don't think that they're probably doable up here in the north, but time will tell. Battery technology continues to improve, and you know, sometimes we forget the batteries have to be recharged, and it takes energy to do that. But don't underestimate the future of electric vehicles and what that means to ethanol and what that means to corn. It's a big issue. You know, in that light, with possible reductions in ethanol and use of corn, you know, there's going to come a point where we're going to need to find some alternative uses for bulk raw commodities, including number 2 yellow corn, soybeans, and the like. You know, and start looking for niche markets. Granted, that's hard to do on a large scale, but quite frankly, farmers are too good at what they do. Sometimes they produce more than the market can absorb. Government aid really helps hold up land values. And ironically, who really benefits from a strong ag economy and government aid? I would say probably landowners as much as anybody. Also of note that all the government aid is trying to do in part is to prevent a health crisis or the COVID crisis from morphing into a financial crisis. Are they being successful? I guess time will tell, but all this government money flowing into the system has certainly given the stock market a sugar high, and whether that's sustainable or not is yet to be determined. I did have to smile a little bit at this this sign, both from a personal standpoint and a banking standpoint. It gives a new meaning to social distancing. Lastly, just a few comments on COVID to wrap it up. You know, I think what COVID did in many regards is it exposed the weak links in our supply chain. I mean, I still go into Fleet Farm, I still go into Menards and see empty shelves, and we still haven't totally caught up with that. If you are trying to get a home appliance or anything like that, you're finding that you can't get them. So COVID has exposed some of that. You know, ethanol, we've talked a lot about ethanol here a little bit, but that is something I think to keep your eyes on. Consumer habits, boy, listen to the consumer. You can see what they were buying during COVID and things like that. So even though that we may not agree with what the consuming public is buying or looking at, they're agricultural's boss. And lastly, you know, COVID is noted as a black swan event, but the reality is black swan events happen about every decade, and this will happen again. Maybe not a pandemic, but there will be something again in the next decade that'll throw us for a loop. And I like what Dr. Cole said, you know, black swan events happen about every decade, and in between there's a couple of babies. So it's managing risk, and good luck in managing that, and good luck in 2020 and what 2021 brings. Thank you.